Thank you for coming back for another video. Last week, I introduced the concept of Jewish Torah literature, which, for the record, is very extensive. It goes beyond just our scriptural canon. I talked about the Torah itself, the first 5 books of Jewish scripture, but that's not really the whole story. Now, for the whole story, we're going to have to go to the entirety of the Tanakh and then get into the rest of Torah literature. So, that being said, the next section of the Tanakh, the next section of Jewish Torah literature is called the Nevi'im. Nevi'im literally translates into English as prophets. As you might imagine, it's a collection of prophetic books. Now, the Torah makes it absolutely certain to us that Moses was the only true prophet. And by that, all I mean is that Moses was the only one who was able to actually speak with God face to face. He was the only one who attained that level of prophecy to where God spoke, and Moses, in his fully conscious state, just sort of understood what he was getting at, and Moses spoke back. We call that prayer, but when God speaks to us, we call that prophecy or insanity. It really depends on what circles you sort of run in. Now, that being said, other Israelite prophets did not have that same level of prophecy. They did not have that same, I don't know if it's the same connection with God, or if it's that they just weren't spiritually attuned. I don't actually know how to say that, but what we do know is that the other Israelite prophets, the ones after Moses, needed a little bit of help to get their prophetic revelations. And by help, I mean they were in an altered state of consciousness. And by altered state of consciousness, no, I do not mean they were on drugs, because it's the 21st century. If I say altered state of consciousness or some variant thereof, everyone's first thought is drugs. These guys were high. They were on magic mushrooms. They were, I don't know, smoking something. I don't know. As it happens, no, that's not the case. Everybody would think that if you say altered consciousness, so it's okay, you're not the only degenerate out there. That's the very first thing I thought too. But they had to be completely sober. So, it's unfortunately, it wasn't quite as fun as drugs. Or fortunately, I don't know. You do you, I guess. It just really depends on how you look at it. So they were sober, totally sober, and when they received their prophecies, they would be either in a dream state or it would come in a vision. And by that, what I mean is simply that they were either dead unconscious, straight up asleep, or they were, let's call it, in a state of emotional ecstasy, and they received a vision. By emotional ecstasy specifically, I'm referring to, everything around it, around them was ideal for the prophet. They weren't hungry, they weren't thirsty, there was no lack of sobriety. Influence. There we go. There was no influence from any intoxicating substances. So there was no wine, no liquor, no anything like that. There was no drugs. They were just, for lack of a better term, in an exceptionally good mood. There would be music playing in the background, perhaps. That happens to be one of the things that is said to help bring on prophecy in Jewish tradition. Did they all, have to go through that whole thing? Well, no. Some of them just went to bed at night and they had a dream, and it was a prophetic dream. which is kind of cool, I guess. But let's be honest here. If there were drugs involved, it would explain so much. Because if you read the opening chapter of Ezekiel, which is a fantastic chapter, it's just the wildest. And when I say fantastic, I mean fantastical. It seems like fantasy. But this was a dream. This was a vision that Ezekiel had. And frankly, if he were, let's say, eating magic mushrooms at the time, if he were under the influence of some kind of intoxicant, drugs, alcohol, whatever, that would explain so much about the visions that he received. Because frankly, if a sober man were to describe these four beasts that Ezekiel describes in the first chapter of his book, even if I know good and well that he's sober, I would really question his sobriety, because it's just so off the wall that, I mean, come on, this guy had to be on something, right? But no, unfortunately, it just depends on how you look at it again. They couldn't be on anything in order for them to be a prophet. And probably the reason for that is because then we would know that it's not the drugs talking. Now, the prophetic books are actually divided up into two sections. You have the Nevi'im Rishonim and the Nevi'im Aharonim, which is the early prophets and the latter prophets. The prophetic books begin with Joshua, Moses' successor. So this puts it back to roughly 3,300 years ago, when the very first of the prophetic books was written. That would be the book of Joshua. And it ends with Malachi, who died sometime in the 5th century. I think it was about halfway through the 5th century BCE. Okay, so that's about 2,500 years ago or so. So this is a massive chunk of time, that we're dealing with here. Now, the books of the prophets, as they are in the order that they are that they appear, in printed versions of the Tanakh, and I'm just going to read them off because it's a lot to remember. The order of the prophets, in their English names, are Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and a book called the 12, which contains the 12, the books, the prophecies of 12 prophets named Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micha, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. I don't remember how they say it in English. Malachi, I think. Not important. So one thing that is important to point out is that, yes, my people were absolutely super creative when they came up with the name of a book called The 12, which contains 12 prophets. I'm telling you, man, it's kind of a thing all throughout history that Jews are just as creative as I am today. It's great. It's wonderful. Now you're going to notice that the number of these books, by the way, we count them as 8 books in total. You're going to notice that the number of them is going to be different from the count of the same books in Christian Bibles. So if you are a Christian, first of all, why? I'm just kidding. Secondly, our count of the books is going to be different than your count of the books. And the reason for that is because either Christians can't count or because Jews can't count. And I think that we can all agree Jews are probably pretty good at counting, since we have an entire nation of accountants, right? I'm joking. No, the real reason is because the Christians actually divided up the books of Samuel and Kings into, rather than the 2 books that Jews have them, they divided them up into 4 books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings. And then they divided up the book of the 12 into the actual 12 prophets. So I'm not sure exactly, who can't count. But we wrote the books, so I guess that gives us the right to count them, right? I don't know. Makes sense. So the Nevi'im Rishonim, that would be the early prophets, are the books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. They are historical narratives, and they actually cover something like 500 years or somewhere in that time period. And I'm just going to read you from my notes about these books, just because there's a lot here. So the book of Joshua details the historical period from the death of Moses to the end of Joshua's life. So it makes perfect sense, because Joshua, could only write about the things that he saw, right? It mostly details the conquest of the land of Israel. And just so that we're clear about this, there were 7 nations in the land of Israel, which was then called Canaan, or we're left to assume that based off of what the Torah says. The word Canaan literally means like merchant. So it's, as it happens, it's right at the intersection of Africa, Asia, and Europe. So if you were going to have a land flowing with milk and honey, if you were going to have a rich land, it would be the land that's right at the intersection of these 3 continents, right on the major trading routes. So there were 7 nations that were in the land already. Of those 7, only one of them survives to the present day, but they do not identify themselves by the same name that they did back then. That nation that still exists, kind of, is the Hittites, who are no longer called Hittites. They're now, we call them Turks. This is the country of Turkey. The Hittites who left the land of Israel ended up going north into what is now Turkey, Lebanon, Syria, that whole northern above Israel region. But again, they don't identify themselves as Hittites, so they call themselves Turks now, which is fine. Doesn't bother me any. So the book of Judges deals with the time period from the death of Joshua to the birth of Samuel. Now, what's interesting about it is the book of Judges mentions Eli, who was the judge when Samuel was born. Sorry, the book of Judges never mentions Eli, who was the judge when Samuel was born. And that's a little bit strange. The book of Samuel just sort of opens up with Eli as both the judge and the Kohen Gadol, that's the high priest, at the sanctuary at Shiloh, but it doesn't ever actually introduce, when he became the judge. And I think that's interesting, because the book of Judges should cover the judges period. Now, a judge in the biblical sense is not necessarily a judge in the legal court sense. We're talking, it's the Hebrew word shofet, which, interestingly enough, you look in some of the other Middle Eastern languages, you're going to find forms of it like shapitu, who were not judges in the necessarily the legal sense of the term, but they were more along the lines of warlords or chieftains who led their people. Yes, they gave laws. Yes, they administrated those laws. They were the court, perhaps, or perhaps they assigned a court. It just depends, different cultures. But one thing that is sure, that we do know for sure, is that these were not, guys in long black robes sitting in a courtroom passing out judgments. No, these were warlords. These were, and if you just read the book of Judges, you'll see, we have judges like, Samson, who single-handedly killed probably at least 1,000 enemies in just the few short chapters about his life alone. He may have killed, significantly more. I don't know. I wasn't there. But I like to imagine that, this guy who is known for being super strong, I like to imagine that, he used that super strongness to, do some more war fighting and that sort of thing. Now, back to the notes. So yeah, the book of Samuel, it opens where Eli is the Kohen Gadol and the high priest. The Kohen Gadol is the high priest, sorry. And he's also the judge. I don't understand how he could have been the judge at the time, because the text describes him as being an old man and a rather heavy-set man. Big enough to where falling backward off of a stool is enough to snap his neck. So I don't know how big you have to be for that, but I mean, he was fairly large. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say about that. I could actually talk for a while about him, but that's all I'm going to say about that. So the book of Samuel goes on to detail Samuel growing up. It's not really very much. It tells us a little bit about the circumstances surrounding his birth, the call to prophecy that he had, because Samuel was a prophet. Again, not in the true Mosaic sense, where he could speak back and forth with God. In fact, the very first time that he has a prophetic calling, God's calling out to him, Samuel, Samuel, and he doesn't understand it. He's like, what is that? Oh, it must be Eli calling me. And so he goes to check with it. But no, it turns out, no, it was actually God. Interesting story. Just kind of shows you, somebody who is intelligent, relatively smart, can still get things a little bit off sometimes. So that's always good for, people like myself. Samuel also has the distinction of having anointed the two first full-fledged kings of Israel. King Saul, who by far is my favorite king. There's not very much about him in the Tanakh, but, he's my favorite of the kings. And not just because he was the first, but because, he was a man's man. This guy was like, he was a man's man. And then King David, who also was a man's man, just kind of in a different sort of way. King David would be like a close second favorite king of mine. Then it records Samuel's death. The book of Samuel records Samuel's death, because of course it does. Now the book of Kings follows, as you might imagine, it follows the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. What do I mean when I say Israel and Judah? Well, Kings Saul and David and Solomon, the very first three kings, and Solomon is toward the bottom of the list of my favorite kings, because we won't get into that, but he made quite a few stupid mistakes that unfortunately sort of set a precedent for his descendants. So he's not really high on my list of favorite kings, but I won't get into it. But Kings Saul, David, and Solomon were the very first three kings of a united Israelite monarchy. This was the kingdom of Israel in its golden age. After Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam inherited the throne. And Rehoboam has a reputation both in the Tanakh and, in my opinion, for being an absolute idiot. The guy was just dumb. And I say that, he took some really stupid advice from his friends, and that ended up angering the northern Israelite tribes, 10 of them, and they rebelled. They seceded from the Union, as it were. They rebelled against the Davidic dynasty, and even though it's remembered as a bad thing that happened, they had a wildly legitimate reason for doing so, and I can't help to think that I absolutely would have joined them, and you probably would have too, because nobody likes being overtaxed. That's what Rehavam did. He just taxed them, and then, like, it was stupid taxes, stupid high taxes, until they split. I feel like every government should really sort of pay attention to that, but that's not important to us. So the northern Israelite kingdom kept the name Israel. I think that's interesting. The southern Israelite kingdom took the name Judah after the ruling tribe. So the tribe of Judah produced King David and his entire dynasty. The northern kingdom, the only kings from Judah that they ever had were David and Solomon. And that was back when they were part of the United Monarchy. So there was a divided monarchy. You had, I don't even know how this happened, that the breakaway Northern Kingdom actually ended up being able to keep their legitimate name. I mean, that would be like, in the American Civil War, that would be like the South keeping the name United States of America, while the North had to change their name to the Confederate States of America. It doesn't make sense. That the breakaway kingdom would be able to maintain the original name of the kingdom, but apparently the southern kingdom didn't really object to it too much. Well, I'm sure they did, but that's, it's not important. Now, as it happens, the northern kingdom of Israel was more politically powerful, and it was wealthier than its southern brother kingdom, if you want to call it that. What's interesting is if you're reading the Tanakh, that's not the impression that you get, and the reason for that is the Nevi'im Rishonim were written by Judeans. They were written by people in the southern kingdom, and so of course they're going to, the north, they did everything wrong, and the south, we did everything right, and everything really is really Judah is the powerful one, because the Davidic dynasty, because of course that's the sort of thing you would expect. It's you could call it polemical writing, you could call it I don't think revisionist history is the right way to say it, but you could think of it as being a sort of whitewashing of historical events, perhaps. I don't know. Now, the Nevi'im Rishonim, they collectively portray a really profoundly interesting period in Israelite history. And it really is hard to put those books down once you start reading them, because they're just so interesting. So if you haven't read them, I highly recommend it. Go ahead. It's good. It's good for you. It's in scripture. It's got to be good, right? Now, fair warning, the Nevi'im Rishonim are full of graphic stories about warfare, political intrigue, and atrocities that I really can't get into because I want to keep these videos as PG as possible, because my kids are watching. Actually, interestingly enough, neighborhood kids are watching. I'm telling you, man, this whole YouTube thing, it's new to me, but it's not new, but the younger generation, they basically thrive off of it. Where was I going? Oh yeah, so the Nevi'im Rishonim they do happen to be some of my favorite books, regardless of how I feel about the political situation, of the time, and the really sort of cringe-worthy things that they've actually got in them. But I highly recommend reading them if you've never read them before, and if you have read them before, I highly recommend rereading them, because it's a lot of good stuff in there, and it actually gives a lot of insight beyond theological content. So there's that. The Nevi'im Aharonim, the latter prophets. I'm going to put my glasses back on here so that I can read off what I've got about them in my notes. They're the remaining books in the section of the Nevi'im. It means the latter prophets. I think I just said that. But they cover less secular topics. The Rishonim, they cover the more secular topics, even though it has a theological twist to it. Whereas the Aharonim, they don't cover so much the secular stuff as much as they do the theological stuff. They're basically what everyone thinks of when we think of the word prophet. These are prophecies that are written down. These are, they're telling us, what's going to happen in the future. They're interpreting what's happening at the time. That, what we think of when we think of a prophet, that's it. They've got a lot of prophecies in them that predict things getting bad before they get better. If it's any consolation, the whole things get better part shows that it gets a whole lot better, objectively better than the golden age of the United Monarchy period. But there's a lot that could be discussed in the Nevi'im Aharonim, and it really is too much for this video to cover. There is, as I said, a lot of theological stuff in there, but a few of the topics are the exile of both Israelite kingdoms, which happened, the fact that I live in the United States, the fact that I'm speaking English, today is evidence of that. My ancestors eventually found their way here after the exile. Prophecies point to a redemption from exile. We're all coming back, or all going back, eventually. The future anointed king of a reunited Israel. We call him, in Hebrew, we call him Mashiach. In English, the common term for him is either anointed or Messiah. Messiah has sort of a Christian connotation in the United States, though. But I'm speaking of the Jewish Messiah, not the Christian concept of Messiah. And the era that the Messiah ushers in. So this is the Messianic age. And if you're only familiar with the Christian version of what all of that means, what you need to do is you need to go back and read these books and look at them objectively and allow them to interpret themselves, because they do. And they paint a very different picture from what Christianity teaches about it. Now, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, and this is just kind of closing thought, if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, you might be wondering why it's not in the prophetic books, because it's not. The reason for that is because Daniel didn't understand all of his prophecies. The Sanhedrin, that's our high court, had a rule that said that if a prophet receives a prophecy, he also has an interpretation for it, which means that he also understands it. However, Daniel, you can see just by reading the book of Daniel, did not understand all of his prophecies, and therefore we don't consider him to be a full-blown prophet. Did he receive prophecy? Yes, absolutely. Is he a prophet? Well, no. Because frankly, anyone who receives some form of divine inspiration, some sort of intuition, that sort of thing, that's also prophecy. So these are low levels of prophecy. Daniel had a higher than most level of prophecy, but lower than the prophets who understood what they were talking about. In fact, the Sanhedrin actually had a rule that said that the prophet had to interpret everything to them so that they could decide if does this prophecy line up with the Torah. So it's interesting because they passed down that knowledge to us. So it's interesting because if you ever hear someone claim that the Jews misunderstood this prophecy, they mistook this passage, they didn't understand it because they're blind or whatever. I don't know what they're saying nowadays. They don't know what they're talking about, because we absolutely do, because the Sanhedrin had to know before it was able to be officially canonized as scripture. They had to know what it was about, and they passed that knowledge on to us. So Anyone who tells you that we misunderstood a prophecy doesn't know what they're talking about. And that's fine, within their own world. But, it doesn't really have any bearing on history. Now, that being said, that's all the time that I'm going to take up in this video. So next week, we're going to go over the next period of Jewish Torah literature, which is also the final section of the Tanakh. It's called the Ketuvim. So thank you for joining me today. Thank you for coming back. If you checked out the last video. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. Hit the notifications button so that you get alerts whenever I post a new video like this one. Like this video if you liked it. Feel free to share it on social media outlet of your choice. I do have a Facebook account set up now. Yay me! I'm still struggling a little bit with X. There are hoops to jump through, I guess, to cut down on bots. But for the time being, I'm on Facebook. So if you're on Facebook, you can find me. Just look for an unorthodox Jew. And then just kind of, like or follow, share the content, whatever the case may be. You do you. So I'm not quite ready yet for X, but I'll let you know how that all plays out in the future. That being said, thank you for joining me once again, and we'll see you next time.